I was 34 when I found out the truth. It wasn't that I hadn't suspected things over the years. Those little moments that didn't add up, the way Rachel's eyes would flicker when I asked too many questions. But nothing prepared me for the bombshell that came out of nowhere. We've been married for 12 years, and to the outside world, we were the perfect couple. People said we were lucky, that we had something real, something everyone else would want. High school sweethearts who'd survived long-distance college years, a few rough patches early on, but always came out stronger. Rachel was my best friend, my confidant, the one person I thought I could trust completely. But trust, as I was about to learn, is fragile. And lies, no matter how long they're kept hidden, have a way of finding their way to the surface. It all started innocently enough. Rachel and I had been invited to a small gathering with some of her old college friends. It was one of those nights where you catch up with people you haven't seen in years and laugh about old memories. We were sitting around, reminiscing, when one of her friends casually brought up how Rachel and I had met in high school. It was a harmless comment at first, but the way Rachel responded made me pause. She didn't say we were together all through high school, like I always assumed. She didn't even mention that we started dating in our senior year. Instead, she said, "Oh yeah, we've known each other since high school. We've been through a lot together." The way she said it, the way she avoided the specifics, set off an alarm bell in my head. Why would she downplay our relationship like that? My mind raced, trying to piece it together, but I didn't say anything right away. I just let it slide, thinking maybe I was reading too much into it. Later that night, one of her old roommates pulled me aside, her face a little too serious. She said something that would change everything. "You should talk to Rachel about the college years. It's something she's never really told you about." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What did that mean? What had Rachel kept from me? I could tell from the roommate's expression that this wasn't something to ignore, so when we got home, I couldn't help myself. I asked Rachel what her friend had meant. She dismissed it immediately. "It's nothing. Really, don't worry about it," she said, brushing me off. But there was something in her eyes, something defensive, that made me press further. I told her I needed her to be honest with me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I told her I was going to stay at my brother's for a few days, just until we could talk things through. When I came back, Rachel was visibly anxious. She told me she had something to admit, and at that moment, I knew my world was about to shift. Rachel confessed that during the first 2 years of college, while we were still in high school and I was at community college, she had been involved with several guys. I couldn't breathe for a second. She said it wasn't a big deal at the time, that we were long distance, that she didn't think our relationship would last. But what she didn't tell me, what she never mentioned before, was how many men there had been. At least 10, she admitted, including 3 guys who I had met and introduced myself to as her friends. She even told me that one of them was someone she still kept in touch with. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I was floored. My mind raced. How had I missed this? How could she have lied to me for all these years? I pushed her for more details, trying to make sense of it all, but each answer only dug the hole deeper. She downplayed it, made excuses, saying it didn't mean anything. But it didn't matter. I could no longer look at her the same way. After she admitted everything, I told her I wanted a divorce. The word felt heavy, like it had been sitting in my chest for too long, and finally, it was out. I started the process almost immediately, and the more I saw Rachel's attempts to downplay what had happened, the clearer it became that there was no going back. Family and friends tried to convince me to forgive her. "Everyone makes mistakes," they said. "You can't throw away all the good years you've had." But to me, it wasn't just a few mistakes. It wasn't just about the infidelity. It was the lies, the manipulation, the years of deception. The worst part wasn't that she had cheated. It was that she had done it with so many people, right under my nose, while I believed we had something solid. My kids, both of whom were teenagers by now, saw what was happening. I didn't want them to feel the tension, but they could sense it. I tried to explain why I needed to end the marriage, why I couldn't keep living with the weight of betrayal hanging over me. They were old enough to understand, but still, it was heartbreaking to watch their disappointment in both of us. I felt torn. My heart was in pieces, but I knew I was making the right decision. In the weeks following the admission, I was bombarded by people telling me I was overreacting. They urged me to think about the good years, the life we had built, but I couldn't. Every memory, every little thing I thought I knew, had been shattered. It wasn't just that she had been with other men. It was the lies, the secretive behavior, the way she dismissed me when I needed the truth. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the years of my life that had been wasted on someone who didn't respect me enough to be honest. I moved out, and Rachel stayed in the house. I could feel the relief creeping in, but it was quickly replaced with anger. How could she be so casual about all of this? How could she act like it was no big deal? I still loved her, but I was furious. And I couldn't stay in a marriage built on such a profound lack of respect. The divorce was going to be messy. It was hard for me to even think about the legal side of things, but I knew I couldn't drag it out. The truth was out now, and so was my decision. There was no way I could go back to her after everything she had done. For the first time in a long time, I was free. But freedom didn't feel like the celebration I thought it would be. It felt like an ending, and even though I was relieved, part of me still mourned the life I thought I had. I still don't know how I missed the signs, but maybe that's what happens when you're in love. You don't want to see what's right in front of you. Rachel and I met when we were just kids, barely out of high school. She was this brilliant, confident girl who walked into every room like she owned it, and I guess I got swept up in her orbit. She was my first everything, my first real relationship, my first serious love. By the time we were in our early 20s, I was certain we were it for each other. We dated through college, navigating the ups and downs of long distance for a couple of years. She went to school in Chicago, and I stayed behind in a small town in Indiana, working and going to community college. We'd see each other once or twice a month, and those weekends felt like the only thing keeping me going sometimes. She was my anchor, my person. At least, that's what I thought back then. We got married not long after she graduated. We were young, maybe too young, but it felt right at the time. I remember standing at the altar, looking at her in that white dress, thinking I'd won the lottery. Everyone told us how lucky we were to have found each other so early, how rare it was to see two people so sure of what they wanted. I believed it, too. The first few years were good. Great. Even. We built a life together. Got a tiny apartment in the city, spent late nights dreaming about our future, arguing over paint colors for a house we didn't even own yet. We had our fights like any couple, but we always found our way back to each other. I was happy. Her friend waved it off, saying, "Oh, those first couple of years at school." We all thought Rachel wasn't the type to settle down, but look at you two now. Rachel quickly changed the subject, but my mind was already spinning. I knew what her friend was hinting at, even if she didn't come right out and say it. That night, after everyone left, I asked Rachel about it. What did she mean by wild years? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. It's nothing. Just stupid college stuff. You know how people exaggerate. But I didn't know, and her vague answer only made me more suspicious. Rachel, just tell me. Was there something I should know about? Her expression hardened. No, you're overreacting. That should have been the end of it. But the way she brushed me off didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something she wasn't telling me. The way her friend had said it, the look on Rachel's face when I brought it up, it was like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. A few days later, one of Rachel's friends, Melissa, the quieter one, pulled me aside after work. She said she didn't want to get involved, but she thought I deserved to know the truth. Her words were careful, like she was walking a tightrope. You should ask Rachel about college again, she said, glancing around as if someone might overhear. About what really happened back then. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't press Melissa for details. I knew she wouldn't say more. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I told Rachel I was going to stay at a friend's place until she was ready to tell me the truth. She looked stunned, like she couldn't believe I was serious, but I didn't care. I needed answers, and I was done pretending everything was fine. After I moved out, the silence hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from being alone. It was the kind that echoes, filling every corner of your mind with questions you don't want to answer. At first, I tried to distract myself. Work became my escape. and I threw myself into it like it was the only thing holding me together. But no matter how many hours I put in, no matter how busy I stayed, the quiet moments still came. And in those moments, I couldn't stop replaying everything Rachel had told me. I thought I knew her. I thought I knew us. But now, every memory felt tainted. The nights we spent laughing over takeout, the lazy Sundays in bed, even the way she used to hold my hand when we watched movies, they all felt like lies. I started questioning everything. How long had she been pretending? How much of our life together was real? One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. At first, I wasn't sure why I was doing it. Maybe I thought I'd find something that would remind me of the good times, something that would make me feel like my life wasn't a total sham. But instead, I found myself staring at pictures of Rachel and me, smiling, happy, completely unaware of the truth that was lurking in the background. It was like looking at strangers. The worst part was that I still missed her. Not the person she had turned out to be, but the version of her I thought I knew. The Rachel who used to dance in the kitchen when her favorite song came on. The Rachel who cried during every wedding we ever went to, no matter how much she pretended to be annoyed by them. That Rachel didn't exist anymore, if she ever had. But letting go of her was harder than I ever imagined. A few weeks after I moved out, I got a call from Rachel. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was hesitant, softer than I remembered. "Hey," she said. I wanted to see how you're doing." I didn't know what to say to that. How was I doing? How did she think I was doing? "I'm fine," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. There was a long pause on her end, and I could hear her take a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot," she said finally, "about everything, about us, and I'm sorry, for everything." Her apology felt hollow. It wasn't the first time she'd said those words, and I doubted it would be the last. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "No," she said quietly. "I want to explain." I didn't want an explanation. I didn't want to hear her try to justify what she'd done, but part of me couldn't resist. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I'd believe them. "Go ahead," I said, leaning back on the couch and bracing myself. She started talking, her words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in for weeks. She talked about how lost she'd felt during those first years of college, how she hadn't known what she wanted or who she wanted to be. She told me she never thought our relationship would last, that she didn't take it seriously until it was too late. "It wasn't about you," she said. "It was about me. I was selfish. I didn't think about how it would affect you because I was too focused on what I thought I needed at the time." Her words felt like knives, each one cutting a little deeper. "Do you even hear yourself?" I said, my voice shaking. "You're making it sound like you just forgot I existed, like I didn't matter to you at all." "That's not what I mean," she said quickly. "You did matter. You always mattered. But I was young and stupid, and I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself to speak without losing it completely. I know I can't undo what I did," she continued. "And I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything. But I needed you to know that I regret it. I regret all of it." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I almost believed her. But then I thought about all the years she'd kept it from me, all the times she'd looked me in the eye and lied. Regret didn't mean anything if it came too late. "I'm glad you feel better," I said finally. "But that doesn't change anything for me." She didn't argue. She just said goodbye and hung up. After that call, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved to hear her admit she'd been wrong, but another part of me was angrier than ever. Her regret didn't erase the pain she'd caused. It didn't give me back the years I'd spent believing in something that wasn't real. I went back to therapy the next day, hoping to make sense of it all. My therapist reminded me that closure doesn't always come from the other person, that sometimes it's something you have to find on your own. I wasn't sure how to do that yet, but I was starting to realize that I couldn't keep waiting for Rachel to give it to me. The next few weeks were a blur. I focused on work, spent more time with friends, and tried to rebuild the parts of my life that had been shattered. It wasn't easy. Some days, I felt like I was making progress, like I was finally moving on. Other days, it felt like I was right back where I started. But slowly, little by little, I was learning to live with the pain. Rachel's words still lingered in my mind, but I was beginning to accept that I might never fully understand why she did what she did. And maybe that was okay. Maybe I didn't need all the answers to start letting go. The weeks after Rachel's call were harder than I expected. I thought I'd feel some kind of relief after hearing her admit what she'd done, but all it did was stir up old emotions I'd been trying to bury. Every time I thought I was making progress, something would drag me back. An old photo I forgot to delete, a song that reminded me of her, or just the silence at the end of a long day. It felt like grief, but worse, because I wasn't mourning someone who was gone. I was mourning someone who had never really existed the way I thought she had. I tried to focus on work, but even that was a struggle. My concentration was shot, and I started making careless mistakes. My boss pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if everything was okay. I lied and said I was just tired, but the truth was, I didn't know how to explain what was going on. How do you tell someone that your entire life feels like a lie? That the person you trusted most turned out to be a stranger? One evening, I decided to go for a run to clear my head. It was something I hadn't done in years, but I needed to get out of my apartment to feel like I was moving forward in some small way. I laced up my old sneakers and took off down the street, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts as I pushed myself harder than I should have. For a few minutes, I didn't think about Rachel or the divorce or the questions that kept me up at night. All I thought about was the pavement under my feet and the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. But when I got home, the weight of it all came crashing back. I sat on the floor of my living room, drenched in sweat, and stared at the wall. I felt like I was running in circles, not just on the street, but in my mind. No matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the memories. They were always there, waiting for me. A few days later, I got another reminder of just how deep Rachel's betrayal went. I was at a bar with some friends when I ran into one of her old college roommates, the same one who had pulled me aside at the reunion and told me to talk to Rachel. Her name was Sarah, and I hadn't seen her since that night. She looked surprised to see me but smiled and came over to say hello. "How have you been?" she asked, her tone cautious, like she wasn't sure if it was okay to ask. "I've been better," I admitted, "but I'm getting through it." She nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I'm sorry for everything you've had to deal with. I can't imagine how hard it's been." There was something in the way she said it that made me pause. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked. About what she was doing in college. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I knew. We all did. But it wasn't my place to say anything. I didn't want to get involved." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always assumed Rachel's lies were her own, but now I realized they'd been part of a larger web of deception. Her friends had known about her affairs, had watched her cheat on me, and said nothing. I didn't blame Sarah, not entirely. I understood why she hadn't wanted to get involved, but it still hurt to know that so many people had been complicit in the lies that had defined my life. I thanked her for her honesty and left the bar soon after. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Rachel's friends, wondering how many of them had known the truth. It was like pulling at a loose thread and watching the whole fabric unravel. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at Rachel, but at everyone who had stood by and let it happen. The next morning, I decided to confront one of the guys Rachel had been involved with in college. He wasn't just a random name from her past. He was still part of our lives, a mutual friend we'd seen at parties and gatherings over the years. His name was Mark, and he'd always seemed like a decent guy. But now, knowing what I did, I couldn't stand the thought of him pretending like nothing had happened. I found his number in my contacts and called him, my hands shaking as I waited for him to answer. When he picked up, his voice was friendly, almost too casual. "Hey man, what's up?" "We need to talk," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "About Rachel. About what happened in college." There was a long pause, and then he sighed. "I figured this might come up eventually," he said. "Look, I didn't know you guys were together at the time. She never told me." His words caught me off guard. "You're saying you had no idea?" "None," he said firmly. "If I'd known, I never would have gone near her. I swear." I wanted to believe him, but the anger inside me wouldn't let go. "And what about afterward?" I demanded. When we were married, and you were still hanging around like nothing had happened? Did it ever cross your mind to tell me the truth? Mark sounded genuinely regretful. I didn't know how. By the time I realized what had happened, it felt like too much time had passed. I thought it would do more harm than good. His excuses didn't make me feel any better. I ended the call soon after, my frustration boiling over. It was like every new revelation only added to the weight I was already carrying. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. That night, I went for another run, hoping to burn off the anger. But as I pounded the pavement, something shifted inside me. I realized I was tired, not just physically, but emotionally. I was tired of letting Rachel's actions, and the actions of everyone who had enabled her, control my life. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how much power I let it have over me. By the time I got home, I had made a decision. It wasn't going to be easy, but I had to start letting go of the anger, the betrayal, the endless questions. It was the only way I was ever going to move forward. The day after my conversation with Mark, I woke up feeling drained but strangely clear-headed. It wasn't that the anger had disappeared. It was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but I was starting to realize it wasn't going to serve me anymore. I could hold on to it, let it eat away at me, or I could start figuring out what came next. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a choice. I went back to therapy that week and told my therapist everything. About the call with Rachel, the conversation with Mark, and how it all made me feel like I'd been living in some alternate reality where everyone knew the truth except me. She listened patiently, then asked me a question I wasn't expecting. "What would closure look like for you?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. I'd spent so much time focused on the lies, the betrayal, that I hadn't even considered what moving on would look like. Did I need Rachel to admit more? Did I need to confront every single person who'd known about her actions? Or was it something I had to find within myself? The question stayed with me long after the session ended. A few days later, I got another email from Rachel. This time, it wasn't an apology or an attempt to explain herself. It was practical. She wanted to meet with me to discuss finalizing the divorce paperwork. I hadn't seen her in person since that night at the cafe, and the thought of sitting across from her again made my stomach churn. But I knew it was a step I had to take if I wanted to move forward. We met at a small office where our mediator had set up a neutral space. Rachel was already there when I arrived, sitting stiffly in one of the chairs with a folder in her lap. She looked different, tired, maybe even a little older, like the weight of everything was catching up to her too. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something close to sympathy, but then I reminded myself why we were there. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. I didn't respond. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. The mediator went through the paperwork with us, outlining the terms of the divorce. We'd already agreed on most things: the division of assets, no alimony, the house staying with her since I didn't want it. It was all straightforward, but sitting there, listening to someone dissect the pieces of what had once been my life, felt surreal. At one point, Rachel broke the silence. "I just want to say I'm sorry again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I didn't look at her. I just nodded, keeping my focus on the papers in front of me. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking an apology could fix this. When it was finally over, we walked out of the office together. For a moment, it felt like old times, just the two of us, walking side by side. But the weight between us was too heavy to ignore. As we reached the parking lot, Rachel stopped and turned to me. "Do you hate me?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling. The question caught me off guard. I stared at her for a moment, trying to figure out how to answer. Did I hate her? I wasn't sure. I hated what she had done, the lies, the betrayal. But hate was such a heavy thing to carry, and I was tired of carrying it. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you, but I don't think I can ever forgive you either." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I understand." We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, before she turned and walked away. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. This was it, the end of the life we'd built together. And while part of me mourned that loss, another part of me felt free for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild. I moved into a new apartment, a place that felt like mine instead of a reminder of what I'd lost. I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned: guitar, hiking, even cooking. It felt strange at first, trying to figure out who I was outside of my relationship with Rachel. But as time went on, I started to see glimpses of the person I used to be, the person I wanted to be again. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw a photo of Rachel with her friends. She looked happy, carefree, like someone who had moved on. For a moment, it stung. But then I realized something. Her moving on didn't diminish the progress I was making. Her life was hers to live, just as mine was mine, and I was finally starting to live it for myself. A few weeks later, I ran into Emily again, the woman I'd met at the bar months ago. We'd exchanged numbers, but hadn't stayed in touch. This time, we ran into each other at a bookstore. She was sitting in the cafe, sipping coffee and flipping through a book. When she saw me, her face lit up with a warm, genuine smile. "Hey," she said. "Long time no see." We ended up talking for hours, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could just be myself. She didn't know the full extent of my past, and I didn't feel the need to unload it all at once. With Emily, everything felt easy, natural. It wasn't about filling the void Rachel had left. It was about starting something new, something real. That night, as I sat in my apartment, I realized I was finally beginning to let go. Not just of Rachel, but of the anger, the hurt, and the questions I'd carried for so long. It didn't mean the scars weren't there, but they didn't define me anymore. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was looking forward instead of back. As things with Emily slowly started to unfold, I noticed something I hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from everything being perfect, far from it, but the kind that came from knowing I didn't have to keep looking over my shoulder. I wasn't walking on eggshells, constantly questioning what was real and what wasn't. With Emily, things just made sense. We didn't jump into anything serious right away. She was patient, which was exactly what I needed. Our dates were simple: coffee shops, long walks through the park, dinners that turned into hours of conversation. I told her bits and pieces about Rachel. Not everything, just enough for her to understand why I was cautious. She didn't push for details, and she never made me feel like I had to rush my healing. One evening, as we sat on her balcony with glasses of wine, she asked me something that caught me off guard. "Do you think you'll ever forgive her?" I didn't answer right away. It wasn't the first time someone had asked me that, but coming from Emily, it felt different. She wasn't asking to make me confront something I wasn't ready for. She genuinely wanted to know. "I don't know," I said finally, swirling the wine in my glass. I used to think forgiveness meant letting her off the hook, like saying what she did was okay. But now, I think it's more about letting go of the hold it has over me. Maybe that's what I need to do, not for her, but for myself. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That makes sense. It's not about her, then. It's about you." "Exactly," I said. "But it's easier said than done." She smiled softly, reaching across the table to take my hand. "You'll get there. And when you do, it'll feel lighter." Her words stuck with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what forgiveness would look like. Maybe it wasn't a grand moment of realization or some big gesture. Maybe it was smaller, quieter, something that happened over time, without me even realizing it. But forgiveness didn't come overnight. There were still days when the anger crept in, when I thought about all the years Rachel had taken from me. And then there were other days when I barely thought about her at all. Those were the days I held on to, the days that reminded me I was moving forward. It wasn't until I ran into one of Rachel's old friends at the grocery store that I realized just how much progress I'd made. Her name was Claire, and she'd always been one of the quieter ones in Rachel's circle. When she saw me, she hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Hey," she said, giving me a tentative smile. "It's been a while." "Yeah, it has," I said, keeping my tone neutral. There was an awkward silence before she spoke again. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For not telling you back then. For not saying something sooner." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected any of Rachel's friends to admit their part in what happened, let alone apologize for it. "It's fine," I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. "No, it's not," Claire said quickly. I knew what she was doing, and I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place, but looking back, I realize how wrong that was. You didn't deserve what happened, and I'm sorry for staying quiet. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Her apology felt genuine, and yet, it reopened wounds I'd been trying to heal. But instead of letting the anger take over, I took a deep breath. Thank you, I said finally. I appreciate that. As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure, not because her apology fixed anything, but because it reminded me that people could change. If Claire could own up to her mistakes, maybe it was time for me to let go of mine too. That night, I sat down and wrote a letter to Rachel. I didn't plan on sending it. It was more for me than for her. I wrote about the pain she caused, about the lies and the betrayal, but I also wrote about what I'd learned since then. I told her I didn't hate her anymore, that I wasn't holding on to the anger the way I used to. By the time I finished, I felt lighter. It wasn't some magical cure-all, but it was a step. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, knowing I might never look at it again. As things with Emily deepened, I realized how different it felt to be with someone who truly saw me. She didn't carry the weight of my past, but she didn't ignore it either. She understood that healing wasn't linear, that some days were harder than others. And she reminded me, in her own quiet way, that I deserved to be happy again. One evening, as we walked along the beach, Emily stopped and turned to me. You seem lighter, she said, her eyes searching mine. I think I am, I said, surprised by how true it felt. She smiled, taking my hand in hers. Good. You deserve that. Looking out at the waves, I realized she was right. I did deserve it. For so long, I'd let Rachel's choices define me, let her lies shape the way I saw myself. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was stronger now, more sure of who I was and what I wanted. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I was looking ahead. Months later, everything came full circle in a way I hadn't expected. Emily and I were solid by then. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just the kind of steady, real connection I'd almost forgotten was possible. My life was finally mine again. I'd found a rhythm, a balance, and though there were scars, they didn't sting the way they used to. One afternoon, I got an unexpected message from Rachel. It was short, just a text. Hey, I know this is random, but could we meet? There's something I need to say. I stared at it for a while, debating whether to reply. Part of me wanted to ignore it. I'd moved on, hadn't I? But another part of me, curious, stubborn, wanted to see what she had to say. Maybe I needed to hear it. Maybe this was the real closure I'd been chasing. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We met at a quiet park, the kind of place we used to go when we were younger. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench and staring at the lake. When she saw me, she stood up and gave a small, hesitant smile. Thanks for coming, she said, her voice softer than I remembered. I stayed standing, keeping some distance between us. What's this about, Rachel? She motioned for me to sit, and reluctantly, I did. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just fiddled with the strap of her bag. Then she let out a breath, like she'd been holding it in for years. I've been thinking a lot, she began, about everything that happened, about us. And I realized I never really gave you the truth, not the full truth. I didn't say anything, letting her continue. I hurt you, she said, her voice trembling. And I justified it to myself for years, telling myself that I was young, that I didn't know what I wanted, that it didn't mean anything. But the truth is, I was selfish. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. And you didn't deserve that. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I could see the regret in her eyes, and for the first time, I believed it. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, she added quickly. I know I don't deserve it. I needed you to know that I see it now. I see how badly I messed up, and I'm sorry. I sat there for a moment, processing what she'd said. It was the apology I'd wanted for so long. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like I thought it would. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the years of hurt or the lies she'd told. But it did feel final. I appreciate that, I said finally. But you're right. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the fact that you broke something I can't put back together. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better. Not for you, for myself. For a moment, I thought about all the anger I'd carried, all the nights I'd stayed awake replaying her betrayals in my head. And then I realized I didn't feel it anymore. The weight of it wasn't there. I hope you find that, I said, standing up. I really do. But I've moved on, Rachel. And I think it's time for both of us to let this go. She wiped at her eyes and gave me a shaky smile. You're a good man, she said. I hope you find happiness. I already have, I said simply, and with that, I walked away. As I left the park, I felt lighter than I had in years. That conversation wasn't closure in the way I'd imagined it would be, but it was enough. Enough to know that I could walk forward without looking back. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up when I walked in, her face breaking into a warm smile. How'd it go? She asked. It's over, I said, sitting down beside her. For real this time. She didn't press for details, didn't ask what Rachel had said. She just leaned into me, her presence grounding me in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. That night, as we sat there in the quiet, I realized that moving on wasn't a single moment. It wasn't a decision or an event. It was a process, one I'd been working through without even realizing it. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I was truly free. Rachel was my past, but Emily was my present, and maybe even my future. And as I looked at her, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.